Around 6,000 years ago, the massive city of Uruk, by far the largest in the world at the time, dominated southern Mesopotamia, in what is now modern-day Iraq. With a population of at least 50,000 people, Uruk held the title of the world's largest city for an incredible 3,000 years, well into the Classical Age. The city was legendary as the home of Gilgamesh, and it was said that a colossal mud brick wall, attributed to the heroic king, once encircled its impressive 6-kilometer radius. But Uruk didn't emerge in isolation. It was simply the most successful in a long line of urban experiments that dated back to the Stone Age, more than 5,000 years before Uruk's founding. Many smaller, yet equally significant, settlements had already begun to form in this region, marking the earliest examples of permanent communal living, essentially, the first cities on Earth. Among these early settlements, Jericho stands out as perhaps the most impressive, not least because of its often cited connection to the biblical walls of Jericho from the Old Testament. 5,000 years before Uruk, Jericho was already a pioneering settlement. It was the first known community in history to be surrounded by walls, showcasing some of the earliest evidence of cooperation among groups larger than a single clan or kinship. Jericho also provides the first significant evidence of large-scale communal labor, and when it was first discovered, it revealed the world's first tower complete with walls and steps. What makes Jericho's achievements even more remarkable is that, apart from some mysterious pictographic symbols, writing wouldn't emerge for thousands of years. Pottery was also not yet invented, but the people of Jericho, millennia ago, managed to accomplish something extraordinary. Although we don't know their origins, ethnicity, or religious beliefs, we do know that Jericho may have been one of the first places on Earth where animals were domesticated and large-scale agriculture was experimented with. All this occurred an astonishing 11,000 years ago, just a few centuries after the last ice age, when woolly mammoths still roamed the Earth. Unlike other ancient cities like Uruk, which relied on fragile ecological conditions and shifting river courses, Jericho benefited from a spring that has never dried up, allowing the city to remain inhabited to this day. This is the story of Jericho, one of the oldest cities on Earth.
In January 1951, a plane landed in the Middle East, carrying one of archaeology's rising stars, Kathleen Kenyon. At that time, archaeology was undergoing a transformation, driven by new scientific methods pioneered by scholars like Egyptologist Flinders Petrie, and the introduction of radiocarbon dating, which allowed for more accurate dating of ancient artifacts. Unlike earlier archaeologists, who often caused significant damage in their quest for discoveries, Kenyon and her contemporaries emphasized meticulous excavation, preserving as much of the ancient sites as possible. Kenyon, a student of the famous Sir Mortimer Wheeler and daughter of the British Museum's director, was called to the shores of the Dead Sea to investigate a particularly intriguing site: Jericho. This wasn't the first time Jericho had been excavated. 20 years earlier, British archaeologist John Garstang had conducted a 6-year investigation of the site, concluding that it was the location of the biblical walls destroyed by the Israelites under Joshua. However, Garstang's findings were heavily criticized, and by 1951, with World War II behind them, Kenyon was asked to re-examine the site. The geography of Jericho has changed little since the last ice age. Unlike other archaeological sites in the region, which were often abandoned due to shifting river courses or rising sea levels, Jericho remains a thriving town. Modern Jericho covers an area of about 15 square kilometers, with lush fields and orchards nourished by abundant underground water supplies. The actual excavation, however, took place at a solitary mound on the town's edge, known today as Tel es Sultan. At first glance, Tel es Sultan might appear to be a naturally occurring hill, but in reality, it is far from natural. Like all tells, it is the result of thousands of years of collapsed mud brick architecture, a mound of debris from previous cities, which were leveled and built over by successive generations over the millennia. As Kenyon approached the site, she knew it was ancient, but she had no idea just how old it was. Kenyon and her team employed stratigraphic excavation techniques, meticulously recording soil layers as they dug, in order to accurately date the various phases of habitation and establish a sequence of events. After initial excavations and re-evaluating Garstang's conclusions, Kenyon determined that there wasn't enough evidence to conclusively link the site to the biblical story. As often happens in archaeology, more digging was required, and in the following year, a small army of laborers joined the effort. The excavation would not be completed until 1958, 6 years later, by which time Jericho had become one of the most famous archaeological sites in history. Garstang had originally dated the earliest settlements at Jericho to the 4th millennium BC, believing that widespread domestication of agriculture and animals had only occurred about 1,000 years earlier. However, Kenyon's findings would change everything. She discovered that habitation at the site had continued for an astonishing 8,000 years, beginning around 9,400 BCE, with the potential for even earlier occupation, though the end date was later revised to around 1,400 BCE, a date still debated by scholars today. Kathleen Kenyon's findings at Jericho revealed astonishing discoveries, the most iconic of which was not Garstang's supposed biblical walls, but a Neolithic tower built approximately 10,000 years ago, making it the earliest known on Earth at that time. Today, more than half of the world's population lives in cities, but there was a time when this was far from the case. Until around 11,000 years ago, Earth had been locked in a seemingly endless ice age. About 25,000 years ago, the planet reached the coldest point of the last ice age, known as the last glacial maximum. However, a steady and gradual melting followed, and after a brief return to cold conditions known as the Younger Dryas, which may have contributed to the necessity of agriculture due to challenging conditions, the world returned to its pre-ice age warm period, allowing humanity to flourish once more. During this period, groups of humans, often called affluent hunter-gatherers, found themselves living in a land of plenty. They hunted game, gathered wild plants and grasses, and traveled from region to region, living a nomadic existence. Around 9500 BCE, these groups began to coalesce around natural springs, oases, and particularly abundant rivers in what we now call the Fertile Crescent, a region known for its rich food supplies. This abundance allowed them, either voluntarily or due to environmental pressures, to begin a new experiment in human living.
This process was helped along by the unique grasses and seeds in the area, some of which could be cultivated and replanted by human hands, providing an almost inexhaustible food source for the future. Though still semi-nomadic at first, over time, as wild grasses were selectively bred to be more edible, these people began to settle permanently. They continued to experiment with plants and animals, driven by the need to feed their families, a necessity that, in time, due to overpopulation and the overuse of natural resources, made domestication both possible and necessary. Jericho, then a large oasis in the Jordan Valley, was one such site. Underground tributaries from the Jordan River flowed into the central mountains to the west, making life not only possible but incredibly fertile in this region, which was uniquely close to the underground water surface. The area was home to an abundance of wild animals and plants, and agriculture may have been harnessed here earlier than in most other places on the planet. However, Jericho was not isolated. From its earliest days, the oasis was at the heart of a thriving system of trading communities scattered throughout the Fertile Crescent. Evidence suggests that Jericho was one of the largest of these communities, if not the largest, though it was almost certainly not the earliest nor the originator of the pre-pottery Neolithic culture that would come to dominate the site, nor of farming or pastoralism, which began elsewhere. In the 1990s, an archaeological discovery in modern-day southeastern Turkey sent shockwaves through multiple academic disciplines. Known worldwide as Göbekli Tepe, this site is perhaps the first religious center on Earth. It is believed to have been built and used by numerous bands of affluent hunter-gatherers who may have shared a common religion and culture. The strange animal figures on the pillars at Göbekli Tepe as well as at other nearby sites, might even be pictographs, a form of primitive hieroglyphics, though their message remains undeciphered. Göbekli Tepe fueled the idea that religion, rather than agriculture, may have been the catalyst for the birth of civilization. The site also provided tantalizing clues about the origins of agriculture, as the oldest known wild relative of wheat is found not far from there. It is not too far-fetched to think that some of those at Jericho may have had some connection with Göbekli Tepe. Professor Stephen Mithen even suggests that after participating in ceremonies at Göbekli Tepe, travelers might have returned to their respective tribes with seeds and the knowledge of how to grow them. Work is still ongoing at Göbekli Tepe, and more is being learned each year. Unfortunately, the similarly ancient and fascinating site of Hefelik Ma, which may have been a similar ceremonial center for hunter-gatherers contemporary with the earliest stages of settlement at Jericho, now lies submerged under a lake, flooded in the 20th century to create a reservoir. This raises the question of whether religion was the primary driver in the formation of the first cities. Perhaps it began as a ceremonial center like Göbekli Tepe, and over time, as people gathered, they began to settle down and build a community. It is even possible that some of the earliest farmers brought the secrets of their agricultural technology to such shrines, sharing them with others during religious festivities. These other groups of hunter-gatherers could have then returned to their homelands with seeds and other resources, such as obsidian. In Jericho's case, perhaps the grain had a ritualized religious significance. Although we may never know for sure, what we do know is that by around 9000 BCE, vast changes in stone technology and a new way of life, what we call the Neolithic Revolution, had arrived in the Fertile Crescent. This was the moment when people first adopted farming, animal husbandry, and communal living. The Tower of Jericho, often referred to simply as the Watchtower, is one of the most extraordinary buildings in human history, not because of its intricate architecture but because of how old it is. Nothing on its scale or size is found again for thousands of years. With a diameter of around 30 feet and a height of 28 feet, it is estimated to have taken around 11,000 days of labor to build the tower, not including the planning or quarrying of resources. When Kenyon first uncovered the tower, it was thought to be the first example of communal architecture on the planet, built around 8000 BCE, a time when the vast majority of humans still lived as nomadic hunter-gatherers. The tower's architecture, including its 5-foot-thick walls and an interior staircase leading to the roof, was completely unprecedented in both scale and design. A significant portion of the community's labor must have been dedicated to its construction, implying a highly organized and motivated society. But what was the purpose of the tower? The settlement where the tower stood was part of the pre-pottery Neolithic culture, which thrived from around 8500 to 7370 BCE. It wasn't the only settlement in the region. Similar sites existed at places such as Zaid and Terra. However, with an area of around 425,000 square feet, Jericho is by far the largest known. Researchers have proposed various theories about the tower's purpose. Some suggest it was a giant grain silo, a defense against external enemies, an early form of a castle, or even all of the above. One of the most convincing arguments, however, is that the tower served a religious function. The religion of the pre-pottery Neolithic people is still heavily debated, and while we may never fully understand it, we can find parallels with other contemporary, earlier, and later sites. Scholars such as Maria Gimbutas have posited the existence of a mother goddess cult that dominated the Fertile Crescent, as evidenced by sculptures and artwork from the region. Gimbutas even argued that this cult inspired the leap to agriculture. However, this idea remains controversial, and other scholars argue for male, animalistic deities, often depicted with phallic symbols at sites like Göbekli Tepe. Perhaps the horns of wild cattle buried under houses in pre-pottery Neolithic Jericho are related to this animal cult. The tower itself contains tantalizingly little evidence. There are no pottery shards, bones, or burials beneath it, and it is not connected to the other fortifications or buildings at the site. Yet, what else but religion, the very worldview of these people, could have motivated a construction like this? Perhaps the tower facilitated accurate observations of the sky, both stars and the sun, or perhaps it served as a place of worship, doubling as an observatory and a temple. We know that in later ages, Shrines and sanctuaries of deities were often built on raised platforms to bring them closer to the heavens. This practice was common throughout the Americas and even in the Greek and Roman worlds, where augurs on the Capitoline Hill looked to the birds to find their destinies. This tradition even survived into early Christianity, with late classical ascetics living atop giant pillars to commune with God. Could the tower at Jericho be an early example of this tradition? If so, who exactly was doing the communing, acting as an intermediary between the community below and the gods above? At Catalhoyuk, a slightly later site, priest-kings are thought to have controlled city life, a tradition that was certainly utilized by later Sumerian cities such as Uruk and Eridu, places with extremely prominent sky gods in their religions. Perhaps 10,000 years ago, shamanistic priest-kings directed rituals from the top of the tower at Jericho, bringing them closer to the otherworld and leaving behind a cultural legacy that would be utilized for millennia to come. As far as most people were concerned, Jericho had the oldest tower on Earth. However, in 1999, a joint Polish-Syrian archaeological team found something astonishing near the modern city of Aleppo, without even particularly looking for it. History was rewritten once again, pushing dates back by thousands of years. At Tel Karkur in modern-day Syria, the team found not just one tower similar to Jericho's, but 5 of them, possibly dating to an astonishing 2,000 years earlier, perhaps as early as 10,000 BCE, making the site roughly contemporary with the ritual center at Göbekli Tepe. The structures at Jericho, which include a ditch and a wall, might not have been intended as a defense against human invaders, but rather as a barrier against the frequent flash floods that plagued the region. For those living in mud brick houses, the threat posed by flooding and the natural elements could have been far greater than that of external enemies, particularly during an era when large settlements like Jericho were extremely rare. Another ancient city, Catalhoyuk in modern-day Turkey, reached its peak slightly later than Jericho and exhibited unique architectural choices. No streets, with houses accessible only by climbing ladders to the roofs. This suggests that the early adoption of settled life in these regions may have been driven as much by the need to guard against wild animals as by the dangers posed by the natural world. Although some animals might have been on the path to domestication, hunting wild gazelles remained a primary source of meat, reflecting a lifestyle that was still heavily reliant on hunting and gathering, even from a sedentary base. The remains of gazelle, cattle, boar, sheep, and goat have been found at Jericho, some of which may have been domesticated, though evidence is scarce and it remains difficult to differentiate between wild and domesticated animals in the archaeological record. Perhaps wild animals were being trapped and kept as food. After all, a wild animal can be kept in a cage and fed before being eaten. It doesn't have to be domesticated, which takes a long time and many generations. The other major food source for these people was, of course, agricultural produce, including wheat, barley, peas, and beans, all of which had been gradually adapted from wild ancestors. The people of Jericho lived in round houses around 14 feet in diameter with sunken mud plaster floors. Each dwelling seems to have been pretty much identical, each with its own grain storage area, suggesting that every household had control of its own food, quite possibly being independent in terms of food production. This is very different from later Sumerian cities such as Uruk, where the priestly class held a deliberate monopoly over food production and society itself was highly stratified. Also, the houses at Jericho seem to be scattered at random throughout the site, each perhaps occupied by a distinct family or kinship group, possibly descended from the tribes who had first come to the city to work together centuries before. Rather than being grouped by profession and class like in later Sumerian cities, people seem to have been grouped around tribal houses, suggesting little social distinction and differentiation between the lowest and highest levels of society. Many scholars believe that Jericho began rather spontaneously, with no central organizational structure, perhaps built from the ground up by hunter-gatherer groups rather than deliberately by priest-kings like the later Sumerian cities. After all, writing, the key to Uruk's success, doesn't appear for another 4 or 5 millennia, and even pottery hadn't been invented yet. Once thought to have been something of an anomaly, in recent years other similar settlements have been discovered in the West Bank region, all sharing a similar culture often called Natufian, with the only major difference between these sites being Jericho's massive size, sprawling over a 10-acre area. Could these be outlying settlements of Jericho or simply related sites separated only by geography but linked in a shared economic and cultural area? We know from archaeological finds that Jericho enjoyed widespread trade links with various other sites throughout the Fertile Crescent, with obsidian, an especially sharp volcanic rock from Asia Minor, useful for making sharp blades, being a particularly prized material during this ancient time. Jericho was almost certainly the focal point of this entire region. Its oasis was simply far more abundant than its neighbors. Yet, with great prosperity always comes a price. Pre-pottery Neolithic age Jericho lasted until somewhere around 7,300 to 7,000 BC, at which time the telephone appears to have been abandoned. Much of the town wall collapsed, and the top of the tower eroded away. We don't know what ended the first city at Jericho, and all manner of conclusions have been drawn from the evidence. Earthquake, pestilence, outside invasion, decline in soil fertility, or all of the above have been suggested as possible causes. Yet within just a couple of lifetimes, in a situation that would eventually become endemic over the long eons, a new city would arise on top of the old. One of the most iconic finds at Jericho dates not to the pre-pottery Neolithic A period of the Watchtower but to the next settlement to arise in the city's long history. A new culture that seems to have taken over the entire region, perhaps after a brief period of decline and abandonment. Whether the pre-pottery Neolithic B culture arose as the result of internal change or external invasion, we can't be sure, but we know more about their material culture than their predecessors. These were the adherents of the skull cult, perhaps one of the earliest known examples of ancestor worship. Kathleen Kenyon, living through an age of war and chaos, saw the pre-pottery Neolithic B culture as a hostile, conquering people who drove out their predecessors through fire and bloodshed. Though in actuality, this isn't at all clear, and it could have been a natural progression from the previous people, perhaps after environmental devastation.
We know that this new group was probably more populous than their predecessors, perhaps growing to a settlement of around 2,000 people, all defended by a new substantial wall. The round houses of the previous city were replaced by rectangular, sometimes two-story buildings, suggesting a definitive cultural shift. Like their predecessors, houses here were still made of mud brick, but were organized around rectangular courtyards with gypsum floors and plastered walls, often painted red with ochre. We know these dwellings were furnished with reed mats, and perhaps paintings such as those at the contemporary city of Catalhoyuk once adorned the walls, though evidence for this is scant. Though people still continued to hunt here, with gazelles making up nearly half of the bones found in the archaeological record, animals had definitely been domesticated too, with aurochs, pigs, and goats showing up in significant numbers. There is also evidence at other sites too of round houses being replaced by rectangular ones around this time, with a phase of fire destruction in between, perhaps most notably at Beida in modern-day Jordan, near the Nabatean city of Petra. Interestingly, 2 rooms were discovered here that may have been used for ceremonial purposes, along with 2 small figurines thought by some to represent fertility deities. Also found throughout the region are animal and human-like figures, perhaps representing ancestors or spirits. Perhaps the most striking feature of pre-pottery Neolithic B Jericho, however, was the practice of plastering skulls, a tradition that seems to have been especially long-lasting and widespread. Upon death, the skull would be removed from the body, perhaps after being left outside to be picked clean by animals, or after a period on display for the community. It would then be filled with clay, and external features molded onto it with plaster, with shells often representing the eyes, and perhaps paint representing facial features. It seems that the body would then be buried underneath the household, with the skull seemingly left on display, though this is a matter of debate, with some seeming to be hidden away under the house. Evidence of similar practices has been found at neighboring contemporary sites, such as Sheikh Ali south of the Sea of Galilee, Tel Ramad near Damascus, Beida near Petra, and Catalhoyuk in Turkey. But what was the purpose of dressing skulls like this? A minority of scholars view these as trophies taken from defeated foes, akin to later headhunting traditions found as far afield as Polynesia and Celtic Europe. Others see them as talismans to ward off evil spirits or ghosts of the deceased. The most likely answer, however, is that they are an example of a religious tradition found all over the world throughout history, particularly in early farming communities, such as those later found in Britain during the Neolithic period. Veneration of the ancestors. Ancestor worship takes a wide range of different forms and is carried out for a number of different reasons. It demonstrated continuity between past and present generations, perhaps preserving the wisdom of those who came before. It may also have been an early form of property claim, with household ownership being demonstrated through ancestral display. They may also have been simply some of the earliest portraits in human history, looked upon to remember dearly missed loved ones. The pre-pottery Neolithic bee settlement at Jericho was an extremely long-lived society, probably existing in much the same state over a period of around 1,000 years, a span of time from the present back to the time of King Canute, longer than the entire history of the Western Roman Empire. Yet nothing lasts forever, and just as Mesopotamia to the east saw the very first inklings of the greatness of Uruk to come, by around 6000 BC, a period of great decline in Palestine was about to set in, a catastrophe so devastating that some scholars see the region as remaining largely depopulated until the 5th millennium BC, well over 1,000 years later. Jericho would never be a regional center again. The lengthy period of 2.5 millennia which separates the pre-pottery Neolithic bee settlement from the Chalcolithic or Copper Age isn't easy to account for. According to Kenyon, the site was abandoned entirely by around 6000 BC, perhaps due to environmental degradation, coupled with overpopulation and poor weather conditions. There are tiny hints of similarly devastating conditions at other sites in the Fertile Crescent during this time, sparking fringe scholars to suggest that if there had been some kind of a genuine apocalyptic flood during this enigmatic period of wandering tribes, significant transformations began to take shape. The adoption of pottery marked a monumental shift, enhancing societal resilience and enabling population growth within these groups.
Pottery allowed for safer food storage, protecting it from pests and preserving it for leaner times. Around 4000 BC, another transformative advancement arrived, potentially brought from Anatolia, just as obsidian had been in previous eras. This innovation was metallurgy, a technology that would soon revolutionize everything. In the Copper Age, also known as the Chalcolithic period, which began around 4000 BC, Jericho gradually became reoccupied, although it remained a minor power. The material culture known as the Gausulian dominated much of the region, but scant evidence of it has been found at Jericho. This suggests that Jericho was not permanently resettled on a significant scale until approximately 3000 BC. During this period, Jericho and its surroundings were characterized more by small communities and villages than by cities or large towns. However, as the 3rd millennium BC began, with Uruk rising to prominence in the east, Jericho's fortunes were set to change as the Bronze Age dawned. By around 3000 BC, Jericho was once again a notable settlement, this time as a regional power equipped with the advanced technology of bronze working. While writing had emerged in Mesopotamia and Egypt by this time, it had not yet spread to Palestine. Nevertheless, walled cities with solid defenses and ramparts became increasingly common, and Jericho followed suit, constructing defensive ramparts and likely maintaining some form of an army. By 2600 BC, Jericho's population had reached unprecedented levels, and 200 years later, an impressive palace complex was built. Although Bronze Age Jericho was not particularly remarkable, it thrived when its neighboring powers were less dominant, allowing it to flourish as an independent state. This period of prosperity did not last, however. Around 2300 BC, the city life in Jericho collapsed, likely due to a combination of environmental catastrophes and warlike neighbors. Until around 2000 BC, the inhabitants of Jericho may have reverted to a semi-nomadic lifestyle. But soon enough, a second Bronze Age Jericho would emerge, the greatest yet seen. Significant archaeological evidence exists for Middle Bronze Age Jericho, including a vast cemetery with vertical shaft tombs and underground burial chambers. The elaborate funerary offerings found within suggest the emergence of local kings. The city was surrounded by an extensive defensive wall, complete with rectangular towers and ditches. It is likely that these fortifications, seemingly destroyed around 1500 BC, are the ones mentioned in the Bible, allegedly connected to Joshua and the Israelites. Yet, all that grandeur was about to be overshadowed by another great civilization to the south and west, Egypt. By around 1900 BC, an epic tale was written on papyrus in Egypt during the reign of the pharaohs. The Tale of Sinu, often compared to Shakespeare, is considered one of the finest works of ancient Egyptian literature. Set during the 20th century BC, nearly 4,000 years ago, the story follows Sinu, an Egyptian official who flees the imperial court after overhearing a suspicious conversation related to the king's death. His adventures take him among the warlike people of Canaan, the land of Jericho, giving us one of our earliest glimpses into life here outside the archaeological record. Egyptians generally viewed foreigners with disdain, and the Tale of Sinu reflects this attitude, describing the inhabitants of the Levantine coast and hinterlands as wretched Asiatics. Despite being mostly fictional, the story reveals the extent of Egyptian influence in the region, which would later become a stranglehold lasting nearly 1,000 years. In the following centuries, inscriptions across the region document Egyptian victories and conquests, suggesting that Jericho was either partially populated by Egyptian colonial administrators or by pro-Egyptian subjects, likely Canaanites. This hypothesis is further supported by the Amarna letters and the absence of Jericho in Egyptian curse tablets, which were written to curse enemies during this time. It is also possible that the Amorites, later founders of Babylon and contributors to Assyria, ruled Jericho for a time, along with the Hyksos, Hittites, and Mitanni, powerful, warlike peoples who exerted influence over the region. Between approximately 1700 and 1550 BC, Jericho reached its zenith. Having mostly lost its independence, the city may have prospered by skillfully changing allegiances, playing rival powers against each other to secure its survival. This period also saw the rise of a chariot-riding ruling class, possibly introduced through contacts with Indo-Europeans in Anatolia, and a general increase in urbanization.
However, what goes up must come down, and by the 16th century BC, Jericho was destroyed. For over a century, it no longer served as an urban center. Interestingly, the wall allegedly destroyed by the Israelites was not found during excavations by Kenyon, though later digs revealed faint signs of habitation until around 1400 BC, the traditional date associated with the Israelite conquests. Unfortunately, erosion and earlier excavation damage have erased significant portions of this layer, making it unlikely that we will ever know the full truth. Despite these setbacks, Jericho was reoccupied once again, and over the next 3.5 millennia, it became a focal point for practically every power that held sway in the region. Today, Jericho remains famous for its purported biblical walls, attracting thousands of tourists each year. However, the true marvel of the site lies in its Neolithic tower, a testament to the ancient and mysterious past. What other secrets might still be buried, waiting to be unearthed? And that wraps up our journey through the ancient city of Jericho. I hope you enjoyed exploring its rich history as much as I did sharing it with you. Don't forget to subscribe, so you're the first to know when our next audiobook adventure is out. Your feedback is gold. Drop a comment below and let me know what you'd love to discover next. And if you enjoyed this, please share it with your friends. Thanks for listening. You're the reason these stories come to life.